It was a crisp morning at the bustling Central train station, a hub of life where people hurried to catch their trains, dragging suitcases, clutching coffee cups, and murmuring into phones. Among the crowd, a middle-aged woman named Margaret stood out, not because of her appearance, but because of the aura she carried. Dressed impeccably in a tailored gray coat and carrying a designer handbag, she exuded an air of entitlement. Her sharp eyes darted around impatiently as she tapped her manicured nails on her ticket. Margaret wasn't one to blend in. She prided herself on being well-spoken and well-dressed, someone who belonged to the right crowd. But beneath her polished exterior lurked an unspoken arrogance, a rigid mindset shaped by years of privilege and narrow-mindedness. As she scanned the waiting area, her gaze landed on an empty seat near the corner. Her pace quickened until her steps faltered. Seated next to the only available spot was a tall black man in his early 40s. His presence was unassuming yet commanding, dressed in a crisp navy suit with a leather briefcase at his feet. His posture was upright, his face calm, with an air of quiet confidence. He was engrossed in a book, oblivious to the hurried chaos around him. Margaret hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her mind raced with unspoken judgments. "I'm not sitting there," she muttered under her breath, glancing at the man with a flicker of disdain. She turned on her heel and marched toward a station attendant. "Excuse me," she said, her tone laced with irritation. "Is there anywhere else I can sit? I'm not comfortable sitting over there." She pointed discreetly in the man's direction, her voice dropping, but the insinuation was clear. The attendant, caught off guard, stammered an apology. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's a full house. That's the only seat left." Margaret sighed audibly, crossing her arms, determined to stand rather than compromise her unspoken principles. Meanwhile, the man glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting hers with a calm, unreadable expression. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he understood everything she thought but chose not to react. He returned to his book, unbothered by her refusal. The atmosphere grew tense, a stark contrast to the serene backdrop. Margaret's prejudice, though subtle in words, spoke volumes through her actions. She stood nearby, her posture rigid, her judgment simmering just below the surface. Unbeknownst to her, this seemingly small moment would soon ripple into consequences far beyond her imagination. Margaret's patience was wearing thin as the minutes ticked by. The overhead announcements droned on, and the hum of the crowd seemed to grate against her nerves. She glanced again at the seat she had refused to take, now glaringly empty. The black man remained seated, flipping a page of his book with an air of calm that irritated her further. Margaret finally snapped. She marched back to the station attendant, this time louder and more insistent. "I already told you," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "I am not sitting next to him." She didn't bother to lower her voice. Heads in the waiting area turned. The young attendant, clearly uncomfortable, tried to de-escalate. "Ma'am, I understand, but we're at full capacity right now. That's the only available seat." Margaret's face flushed with indignation. "Are you telling me I have no choice but to sit there? I'm paying for this service and I demand better accommodations. Surely there's somewhere more appropriate for me." Her words were dripping with disdain, and the implication of what she meant by more appropriate wasn't lost on anyone. The murmurs in the waiting area grew louder. A mother sitting nearby pulled her child closer, whispering something with a disapproving shake of her head. A young man in headphones pulled one earbud out, staring openly at the commotion. A middle-aged couple exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions torn between discomfort and annoyance. Despite the growing attention, Margaret didn't relent. "I shouldn't have to lower my standards just because this station can't manage its seating properly," she declared, her voice rising even further. Meanwhile, the black man looked up from his book. His deep brown eyes met Margaret's for a moment, and he seemed to study her, not with anger or judgment, but with a quiet understanding. He closed his book gently and stood up, towering slightly over the flustered woman. With a calm and measured voice, he spoke. "Ma'am, you're welcome to take this seat if it makes you more comfortable." His words were simple, but the grace with which he delivered them silenced the room. For a moment, Margaret was taken aback, her indignation faltering under the weight of his composure. She opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. The man didn't wait for her reply. Instead, he turned and walked a few steps away, finding a spot to stand near the platform's edge. As he leaned against a column, he reopened his book, his expression unbothered. The reactions around them were palpable. A few people shook their heads at Margaret in silent disapproval. Others stared at the man, clearly impressed by his dignity. The young mother whispered, "That man's got more class in his little finger than she does in her whole body." Margaret, however, refused to acknowledge the scene she'd caused. She sat down in the newly vacated seat, her movements stiff and defensive. But the weight of the moment lingered in the air, the whispers and judgment of the crowd quietly enveloping her. And yet, as she sat there, Margaret felt an unshakable discomfort, not from the seat itself, but from the realization that she had lost control of the situation. She may have claimed the chair, but in the eyes of everyone else, she had lost something far more valuable: her dignity. Margaret leaned back in her seat, still simmering with indignation, though she felt the sting of humiliation from the public's judgment. Yet, she quickly shoved the moment aside, as she always had with unpleasant situations. For Margaret, the world was divided into categories: people who mattered and people who didn't. This mindset wasn't entirely her own invention. It had been instilled in her from a young age. Margaret had grown up in an affluent suburban neighborhood where diversity was almost non-existent. Her parents, while not overtly hateful, had often spoken in veiled terms about people knowing their place. Her father, a successful businessman, often made offhand remarks about how those people didn't work as hard, and her mother would nod in agreement, insisting they meant well but simply weren't like us. These comments, subtly wrapped in politeness, had shaped Margaret's worldview. In her adulthood, Margaret had carried those biases forward, now cloaked in a veneer of social acceptability. She worked her way into a mid-level managerial position at a finance firm, where she thrived by aligning herself with like-minded colleagues and maintaining her carefully constructed image of superiority. Her disdain for others was rarely expressed outright but showed through her actions, avoiding diversity training workshops, favoring certain employees over others, and maintaining an exclusive social circle. Meanwhile, the black man Margaret had insulted on the train platform had walked a vastly different path. His name was James Carter. Born to a single mother in a working-class neighborhood, James had faced adversity from the start. He remembered the sting of being judged not for his character, but for his skin color, starting with teachers who underestimated his abilities and peers who mocked his ambition. But James's mother, a resolute and hard-working woman, had instilled in him the value of perseverance. "You've got to be twice as good," she would say, "to get half as far, but don't let that stop you." James took her words to heart, excelling academically despite the odds. He earned a scholarship to a prestigious university where he faced new challenges: microaggressions, dismissive professors, and the constant pressure to prove himself. But James didn't let bitterness consume him. Instead, he worked harder, graduating at the top of his class before earning a law degree. As a young lawyer, James quickly made a name for himself by taking on cases that others wouldn't, cases that involved systemic injustice and underprivileged communities. His integrity and relentless pursuit of fairness eventually earned him a position as a judge. James carried his mother's lessons with him every day, treating everyone who entered his courtroom with respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Years passed, and Margaret's life took an unexpected turn. Her comfortable world began to crumble when she became entangled in a fraudulent investment scheme at her firm. Greedy for a larger share of the profits, Margaret had knowingly signed off on falsified documents that funneled client money into risky ventures. At first, it seemed like a harmless shortcut, a chance to boost her standing in the company. But when the scheme unraveled, the consequences were devastating. Clients filed lawsuits, the company faced bankruptcy, and Margaret was one of the first to be investigated. Despite her attempts to cover her tracks, evidence of her involvement surfaced. Her polished facade cracked as her colleagues distanced themselves, leaving her to face the fallout alone. Summoned to court, Margaret was consumed by fear. She had always believed herself to be untouchable, someone who could talk her way out of trouble. But now, standing outside the courtroom, she felt the weight of judgment, not just from the law but from everyone who had once admired her. When the bailiff called her name, Margaret entered the courtroom, her heart pounding. She avoided looking at the spectators, focusing only on the seat she was directed to. The judge had not yet arrived, and she clung to the faint hope that she could plead for leniency. But when the door to the judge's chambers opened, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. There he was, Judge James Carter, the man she had refused to sit beside on the train platform. His face was calm, his gaze steady, just as it had been that day. Margaret felt a wave of nausea as memories of her arrogance and disdain came rushing back. She tried to convince herself that he wouldn't remember, that he had likely dismissed the encounter as trivial. But as Judge Carter adjusted his robes and looked out at the courtroom, his eyes briefly met hers, and in that fleeting moment Margaret knew. He remembered. James, however, showed no outward reaction. His expression was professional, his tone neutral as he began the proceedings. Yet Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of shame, knowing that the man she had dismissed so callously now held her future in his hands. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Margaret had spent her life believing she was superior to others, yet here she was, facing the consequences of her actions before a man whose dignity and integrity far surpassed anything she could claim for herself. Margaret adjusted her jacket nervously as she strode into the courtroom, determined to project an air of confidence. She had always believed in appearances, that looking composed and collected could sway perceptions in her favor. Even now, with her career in ruins and her reputation tarnished, she clung to that belief like a lifeline. Her lawyer, an expensive man in an expensive suit, walked beside her, murmuring reassurances she barely heard. She scanned the room, noting the quiet hum of people in the gallery and the imposing presence of the court staff. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the defendant's table, her confidence wavering slightly. But as the door to the judge's chambers opened and the presiding judge entered, Margaret's world came crashing down. There he was, the same man she had insulted so openly at the train station, the man she had refused to sit beside, the man she had dismissed with nothing more than a glance. Judge James Carter. Her breath caught in her throat as the memories flooded back. The disdain in her voice, the look on his face, the way he had offered her the seat with quiet dignity. She had convinced herself that the moment had passed, insignificant in the grand scheme of her life. But now, standing before him in this courtroom, it felt monumental. Margaret's heart began to race. Does he remember me? She wondered, her thoughts spiraling into panic. He has to. How could he forget someone treating him like that? She imagined the worst, that he would hold it against her, that he would take revenge by ensuring the harshest sentence possible. Her carefully constructed composure began to crack. As Judge Carter took his seat, he glanced at the courtroom, his expression unreadable. His gaze fell on Margaret for a brief moment, and her stomach twisted. There was no recognition in his eyes, or perhaps there was, but he concealed it masterfully. His face betrayed nothing but professionalism as he began the proceedings. "Good morning," Judge Carter said, his voice calm and steady. "This is the case of Margaret Whitfield versus the state. Are both parties ready to proceed?" Margaret felt her lawyer respond, but the words barely registered. She was fixated on the judge, waiting for some sign that he remembered her. Yet he showed none. He addressed her case with the same measured tone and impartiality he would give any other defendant. As the trial unfolded, Margaret's emotions swung wildly. Shame gnawed at her as she listened to the evidence against her, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. Fear gripped her as witnesses testified, their words painting a damning picture of her involvement in the fraudulent scheme. But above all, guilt consumed her every time Judge Carter spoke. He treated her with fairness, allowing her lawyer to argue her case without interruption and ruling on objections with impartiality. There was no trace of personal vendetta, no hint of bias. His demeanor remained steady, his words precise and deliberate. For Margaret, this was the ultimate humiliation, not his anger or retribution, but his grace. It was a stark contrast to her own behavior that day on the train platform. She had judged him unfairly, dismissed him without thought, yet here he was, embodying the very integrity and professionalism she had spent her life pretending to possess. As the day wore on, Margaret's shame deepened. She began to see herself through his eyes, not just as a defendant, but as a person who had once been so blinded by prejudice that she couldn't recognize the worth of another human being. She realized that her behavior had said more about her character than his. When the trial adjourned for the day, Margaret remained seated for a moment, her head bowed. She felt exposed, as if the entire courtroom had seen the truth of who she was. Judge Carter rose and left the bench without a second glance, leaving her to sit in the weight of her own regret. It was in that silence that Margaret understood. His fairness and professionalism were not just a reflection of his role as a judge, but of his strength as a person. In the face of her disdain, he had chosen dignity, and now, in the face of her disgrace, he had chosen justice. The trial had been grueling, dragging on for days as witness after witness testified against Margaret. Her lawyer fought valiantly, attempting to cast doubt on the evidence, but it was an uphill battle. The documents were damning, the testimonies unshakable, and Margaret's own paper trail left little room for ambiguity. Margaret sat silently as the prosecution delivered their closing arguments, her confidence long gone. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The reality of her situation had sunk in. There was no escaping the truth. She had knowingly participated in fraudulent activity, prioritizing her own gain over ethics and legality. And now, she was about to pay the price. As Judge James Carter prepared to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into an almost tangible silence. Margaret stared at the bench, her heart pounding. The memory of their encounter at the train station still lingered in her mind, an ever-present source of shame. She knew she was guilty, but she feared what he might say, not because she thought he would be unfair, but because she dreaded the truth he might reveal. Judge Carter began, his voice steady and clear. "Ms. Margaret Whitfield, the evidence presented in this case has been overwhelming. It is clear to this court that you willingly participated in fraudulent financial activities, actions that caused significant harm to your clients and violated the trust placed in you by your position." He paused, his gaze falling on Margaret. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a weight that seemed to pierce through her. She felt exposed, as if he could see every flawed part of her character. "What troubles this court," he continued, "is not just the financial damage caused by your actions, but the underlying mindset that allowed these choices to seem acceptable. You are someone who has been afforded opportunities and privileges that many can only dream of. Yet, instead of using that position to uplift others or act with integrity, you chose to abuse it for personal gain." Margaret flinched at his words, her shame deepening. Judge Carter's tone softened slightly, but it remained firm. We are defined not just by our actions, but by how we treat others, whether in positions of power or in moments of fleeting interaction. Every decision we make reflects our character. It is my hope that this experience will serve as a turning point for you, a chance to reflect on the impact of your choices, both legally and personally. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. His words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. He wasn't just condemning her crimes, he was holding up a mirror to the person she had become. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison, along with mandatory restitution to her victims and a requirement to complete community service upon her release. The sentence was fair, lenient even, considering the damage she had caused. But to Margaret, it felt heavier than she had imagined. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, Margaret avoided looking at the spectators, but she could feel their eyes on her. The humiliation was unbearable, but it wasn't just the public judgment that weighed on her. It was the realization of how far she had fallen, not just legally, but morally. In the days that followed, Margaret began to confront the consequences of her actions. Her social circle abandoned her, her name became a cautionary tale in the media, and her once pristine reputation was reduced to rubble. In prison, she had nothing but time to think, to reflect, and to reevaluate her life. She couldn't forget Judge Carter's closing remarks. His words echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront not only her crimes, but also the prejudice and entitlement that had shaped so much of her life. She realized that her disdain for others had cost her more than she could have ever imagined. It had blinded her to the humanity of those around her and to the flaws within herself. Over time, Margaret began to change. She participated in prison programs, including diversity and empathy workshops, and started volunteering to help other inmates learn financial literacy. It wasn't easy, and it didn't erase her past, but it was a start, a small attempt to rebuild something from the ashes of her former life. For Margaret, the journey was far from over. But for the first time, she understood what it meant to treat others with dignity, to value integrity over image, and to see people as more than the labels she once placed on them. Judge Carter's fairness had taught her what true strength looked like, not in arrogance or power, but in justice and humanity. Months after the verdict, Margaret Whitfield sat in the stark, confined space of her prison cell. The cold gray walls offered little comfort, but they provided the solitude she needed to reflect on the life she had lived and the choices that had brought her here. The world she once knew, a world of privilege, polished appearances, and shallow values, was gone. In its place was a raw, unfiltered view of herself, stripped of pretense. For the first time in years, Margaret was honest with herself. She thought about the people she had hurt, not just through her crimes, but through her attitudes and actions. She remembered the disdainful way she had treated others she deemed less than, including Judge James Carter. That brief encounter on the train platform, which she had dismissed as trivial at the time, now stood out as a defining moment in her life. The clarity was painful, but necessary. Margaret realized that her prejudice and entitlement had blinded her to the humanity in others. She had spent her life looking down on people, only to find herself humbled by one of the very individuals she had disrespected. Margaret's time in prison was transformative. She threw herself into every program available, determined to emerge as a better person. She attended diversity and empathy workshops, where she was forced to confront the roots of her biases and hear the stories of others who had faced prejudice and adversity. For the first time, Margaret listened, not defensively or dismissively, but with an open heart. She also began volunteering within the prison, teaching basic financial literacy to fellow inmates. It was a small step, but it felt meaningful. Helping others, especially those she might have once ignored or judged, gave her a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She wrote letters of apology to the clients she had wronged and pledged to use her restitution payments to make amends. Meanwhile, Judge James Carter continued his work in the courtroom, unshaken by the weight of cases like Margaret's. His reputation for fairness and professionalism grew, and he became a mentor to young lawyers and judges who admired his integrity. James often reflected on the responsibility of his position, not just to uphold the law, but to embody the principles of justice and humanity. For him, the courtroom was not just a place to decide guilt or innocence, but a platform to remind people of their shared dignity and the importance of equality. He rarely thought about Margaret Whitfield specifically, but when he did, it wasn't with bitterness. He hoped that she had found the strength to change, to learn from her mistakes, and to grow into a better person. For James, that hope was enough. His purpose wasn't to punish, but to inspire accountability and reflection. Years later, after serving her sentence, Margaret stepped out into the world a changed woman. She was no longer the polished, entitled figure she once was. Her time in prison had stripped away her arrogance and replaced it with humility. She sought out opportunities to give back, volunteering at community organizations and speaking at workshops about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of integrity. Margaret knew she could never erase her past, but she could use it to help others avoid the same mistakes. In one of her talks, she recounted her experience in court and the profound impact Judge Carter had on her. "He didn't just judge me," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "He showed me what it means to treat others with dignity, even when they don't deserve it. That lesson changed my life." The story of Margaret Whitfield and James Carter serves as a testament to the power of accountability, forgiveness, and growth. It is a reminder that even the most flawed individuals can change if they are willing to confront their mistakes and work to make things right. Judge Carter's unwavering commitment to justice and Margaret's journey toward redemption illustrate a broader truth. Respect and equality are not just ideals, but actions we must choose every day. In a world often divided by prejudice and misunderstanding, their story shines as a beacon of hope, a call to see one another not through the lens of bias, but through the shared humanity that connects us all.